It was a crisp morning in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, the kind where the air carried the scent of early spring and the world seemed quiet before the bustle of the day began. 9-year-old Marise Chiverella had woken up full of energy, ready for another school day. She was a bright, kind-hearted girl, small in stature, but with a big heart. That morning, she carefully packed a few canned goods into her school bag, a small gift for one of her teachers as part of a classroom donation. It was the kind of thing Marise did, often small acts of kindness that seemed second nature to her. She left her home early, excited to start the day. But unknown to her family, her teachers, and her friends, this would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Minutes turned into hours. The school bell rang. Class began. But Marise never walked through the doors. At first, people assumed she was late. Maybe she had stopped somewhere along the way. Maybe she had forgotten something and turned back. But as the hours stretched on, unease crept in. Where was she? By noon, that unease had turned into full-blown panic. Something was wrong. Marise wasn't the type to wander off. She was responsible, careful, the kind of child who followed the rules. Had she been delayed? Had something distracted her on the way? Or had something far worse happened? Her family, desperate for answers, contacted the police. The search began immediately. The search party wasted no time. Neighbors combed the streets, police officers knocked on doors, and Marise's name was called out in every direction. They checked alleyways, parks, backyards, anywhere she might have gone. But deep down, a chilling fear gripped the town. This wasn't just a case of a child running late. Something felt different. Hours passed with no sign of her. Then, as the afternoon waned, the search came to a heartbreaking end. Marise's lifeless body was discovered in a desolate strip mine miles from where she had last been seen. The details were almost too horrific to comprehend. She had been assaulted and strangled, her small frame discarded like she was nothing. A cruel, senseless act of violence had ended the life of a girl who had only just begun to live. The town of Hazleton reeled in shock. This wasn't the kind of place where things like this happened. Children walked to school without fear. People left their doors unlocked. But now, all of that had changed. The crime scene provided few clues, but one thing was clear: the person responsible had vanished into thin air. Who could do something so monstrous? Investigators worked around the clock, piecing together Marise's last known movements. She had left home early that morning, walking her usual route. It wasn't far, just a short walk. So how did she end up miles away in a remote strip mine? Police interviewed everyone they could: neighbors, classmates, shop owners, anyone who might have seen something. But no one had noticed anything unusual. No suspicious cars, no strangers lurking near her path. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. But then came the first lead. Somewhere near the crime scene, detectives found something chilling: small signs of a struggle. There were marks in the dirt, evidence that Marise had fought back. But against who? Was it someone she knew? Someone who had tricked her into going with them? Or was it a stranger, someone who had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The police didn't know it yet, but they were dealing with a predator who had committed the perfect crime. A ghost who left almost no trace. And unless they found answers fast, Marise's killer would walk free. Forever. The brutal murder of Marise Chiverella sent shockwaves through Hazleton, a town that had once felt safe and predictable. Now fear crept into every corner. Parents who once let their children walk to school without a second thought suddenly refused to let them out of their sight. The sight of a lone child on the street became a rare one. Doors that had remained unlocked for years were now bolted shut, windows double-checked at night. The feeling of community was still there, but now it was laced with suspicion. Every man who didn't have an alibi was whispered about. Every stranger passing through town was watched with wary eyes. People wondered, was the killer still among them? Had they unknowingly crossed paths with the monster who had stolen Marise's life? Marise's family, crushed by grief, pleaded for answers. They attended every press conference, spoke with every investigator, and refused to let the case fade into the background. But despite their cries for justice, the investigation stalled. The initial wave of tips and leads quickly dried up. Detectives chased theories that led nowhere. They interviewed suspects who had solid alibis. The forensic tools of the time limited, primitive compared to today, offered no real breakthroughs. As the weeks turned into months and months into years, hope began to wither. Would Marise's murderer ever be caught? Or was this a nightmare that Hazleton would have to live with forever? As the years passed, the town tried to move on, but the Chiverella family never did. For them, every birthday, every holiday, every moment of happiness was overshadowed by the empty seat at the table. Marise's absence was a wound that never healed. Meanwhile, the case sat in police archives, growing colder with each passing year. The officers who had first investigated her murder eventually retired. New detectives inherited the case, flipping through old reports, revisiting old leads, but always hitting the same dead ends. Decades passed. People whispered about the case, sometimes in hushed tones, sometimes in frustrated anger. How could a crime so horrific go unsolved for so long? It seemed hopeless. But then something happened that no one could have predicted. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a long-lost witness. It wasn't even new evidence. It was something far more powerful than that. Something that didn't even exist when Marise was murdered. Science. By the time the 21st century arrived, forensic science had transformed beyond recognition. DNA analysis, once an impossible dream, was now solving crimes that had remained cold for decades. Cases that had seemed unsolvable were suddenly being cracked wide open, not by eyewitnesses, not by new suspects, but by invisible genetic fingerprints left behind by the killers themselves. And in the early 2000s, investigators turned back to the evidence in Marise's case. The items collected from the crime scene evidence that had been carefully stored away for decades were now being tested with cutting-edge DNA technology. And then a breakthrough, a DNA profile. It belonged to an unknown male. For the first time in nearly 50 years, police had something concrete, a trace of the man who had taken Marise's life, a ghost from the past finally leaving his mark. But there was one enormous problem. When investigators ran the DNA through their system, they expected a hit, a match to someone already in the criminal database, a name, a face, a record. Instead, they got nothing. No match, no suspect. The DNA told them who, but without a name. What good was it? Science had given them a key, but the door to justice remained locked. So what happens when you have the answer, but not the name? Where do you go when science gives you the truth, but not the whole story? The answer: you turn to someone who knows how to find the missing pieces. Fast forward to 2022. Nearly 50 years had passed since the murder of Marise Chiverella. An entire generation had grown up in Hazleton, knowing her story as a cautionary tale, one that remained unresolved, a lingering wound in the town's history. It seemed like the case would remain unsolved forever. The DNA profile had given investigators hope, but without a direct match in any database, they were stuck. Then came Eric Schubert. Not a detective, not a forensic scientist, not even a seasoned investigator, just a college student, a history buff with an unusual hobby: genealogy. Schubert had spent years diving into ancestry records, helping people build family trees, reconnecting long-lost relatives, and solving historical mysteries. To most, genealogy was just a way to learn about their past. But Schubert saw something more: an opportunity to use DNA to uncover secrets that had been buried for decades. And in 2022, he turned his skills towards something much bigger than tracing family histories. He wanted to solve a murder. But could a young amateur really succeed where decades of seasoned professionals had failed? Schubert had spent years mastering the art of genetic genealogy, analyzing DNA and tracing it through generational records. But let's be clear, Schubert wasn't originally in the business of solving crimes. He was solving family mysteries, helping adoptees find their biological parents, reconnecting families who had lost touch, and digging deep into forgotten bloodlines. Yet the same techniques he used to map out family trees could be applied to something much darker: finding a killer. When he partnered with the police on Marise's case, everything changed. He took the DNA profile from the crime scene, the same DNA that had sat in a database, nameless and useless, and did something new. Instead of waiting for a direct match, he compared the DNA to public genealogical databases, searching for distant relatives. Even a small genetic link could lead to something bigger. And then it happened. A breakthrough. He found them. Not the killer himself, but his family distant relatives who shared fragments of DNA with the unknown suspect. It was like finding a single puzzle piece in a thousand-piece mystery. It wasn't the full picture, but it was enough to start filling in the gaps. Now, all they had to do was follow the branches of this twisted family tree until they found the one name that mattered most. Piece by piece, the puzzle started coming together. The relatives Schubert identified had never met the killer. They had no idea they were connected to one of the most horrifying crimes in Hazleton's history. But their DNA told a different story. As Schubert and investigators traced the bloodlines, they eliminated one name after another: distant cousins, uncles, brothers, until only one possibility remained. And then, finally, the moment of truth. A name emerged from the branches of this genetic tree: James Paul Forte. A name no one had considered before. A man who had lived in Hazleton. A man with a criminal record. A man who had died decades ago, taking his secrets to the grave. But he had left behind one thing he could never erase: his DNA. James Paul Forte. A name that had never been on investigators' radar. A man who had lived in Hazleton, walked the same streets as Marise, and yet had somehow escaped suspicion for decades. At first glance, Forte seemed unremarkable. He had worked various jobs, never making much of an impact on those around him. He wasn't a well-known figure in town, nor was he the type to draw attention to himself. But there was something in his past that couldn't be ignored. He had a criminal record. And here's where things got truly chilling. In 1974, the very same year that Marise was murdered, Forte had been arrested for sexual assault. The details of that case were disturbing. It was a violent offense, a clear red flag. Yet somehow, after his arrest, he had been allowed to slip back into society. His past had been buried, forgotten by most. Had the police missed something all those years ago? Could they have stopped him back then? And the biggest question of all, was this his only crime? Or had there been other victims? Could it really be that simple? Had the answer been hiding in plain sight all along? Identifying Forte as a suspect was a major breakthrough. But in law enforcement, a theory isn't enough. They needed proof. They had a DNA profile from the crime scene, the same DNA that had led them to Forte's family. Now they needed to compare it directly to Forte himself. But there was one massive problem. James Paul Forte had been dead since 1980. There would be no interrogation, no confession, no trial. So, how do you get DNA from a man who's been dead for decades? There was only one way to be absolutely sure. The answer: exhumation. Authorities obtained permission to dig up James Paul Forte's remains, retrieving what they needed for a definitive test. The process was delicate. The body had been buried for over 40 years, but science had advanced to a point where even time itself could no longer protect a killer. Once the DNA sample was collected, it was sent to the lab compared against the genetic material left behind at the crime scene in 1974. The results came back, and when they did, there was no question. It was a match. James Paul Forte was the man who had abducted, assaulted, and murdered 9-year-old Marise Chiverella. After nearly 50 years, the case was finally solved. The ghost who had haunted Hazleton for decades had a name. And though Forte would never face justice in a courtroom, he would never be able to hide in the shadows again. For nearly 50 years, James Paul Forte had remained a ghost, a nameless figure hiding in the cracks of history, walking free for years before slipping quietly into death, never facing the consequences of what he had done. He had carried a dark secret to his grave, the violent, senseless murder of a 9-year-old girl who had simply been walking to school on a chilly March morning. And for decades, it seemed as though he had gotten away with it. But here's the thing about justice: it doesn't always come when we expect it, but it never stops searching. Modern science had reached into the past, unearthing the truth Forte had thought was buried forever. His name was no longer hidden, his crime no longer a mystery. Though he would never sit in a courtroom, never be handcuffed, never answer for his sins, he had finally been exposed. And in the end, that exposure was its own form of justice. For nearly half a century, the Chiverella family had lived with unbearable pain. Every birthday, every holiday, every year that passed Marise's absence was a wound that never fully healed. They had spent decades not knowing. Who took her? Why did they do it? Would they ever get answers? And now, suddenly, they had them. But did it bring relief, or did it bring another kind of grief? Marise's brother, sisters, and parents had long imagined what it would feel like to know the truth, to have a name, to be able to point to someone and say, "He did this." But the reality was bittersweet. Yes, they had answers, that there would never be justice in the traditional sense. No arrest, no trial, no punishment. Forte had died on his own terms, decades before the truth caught up with him. He had escaped judgment in life. The Chiverella family had waited so long for closure. But now that they had it, they had to ask themselves, was this really closure, or just another cruel twist in a story that had already brought them so much pain? Hazleton had never forgotten Marise Chiverella. Even as the years passed and new generations grew up in the town, her story remained, a tragic reminder that monsters could exist even in small, quiet places. And now, after all this time, the truth was finally known. For some, it brought a sense of relief. The mystery was over. The name of the killer had been etched into history, ensuring that he would never be remembered as anything but what he was: a predator. But for others, the truth wasn't enough. Yes, they knew who had done it, but how many other James Paul Fortes had walked free for decades? How many other cases had been left unsolved, with families still waiting for their own answers? Would this case serve as a turning point? Or would it only stand as a grim reminder of the justice that never came in time? Marise Chiverella's case wasn't just about solving a mystery, it was about proving that justice has no expiration date. For nearly 50 years, investigators had chased leads, questioned suspects, and combed through every possible detail. Yet, despite their dedication, the case remained cold. Traditional police work had reached its limits. And then came genetic genealogy, a tool that had succeeded where decades of detective work had failed. By tracing DNA through family trees, an amateur genealogist had uncovered the truth that had remained hidden for so long. It wasn't a confession, a witness statement, or a sudden tip that cracked the case. It was science. This method had already revolutionized criminal investigations. Cases once thought unsolvable murders, assaults, disappearances were suddenly being reopened, their killers unmasked decades after their crimes. So here's the real question. How many more cases like Marise's are out there? How many families are still waiting for answers? How many killers think they've gotten away with it, never realizing that their past is just one DNA test away from catching up with them? The truth is, forensic science is evolving faster than ever. When Marise was murdered in 1974, investigators didn't even know DNA could solve crimes. It wasn't until the late 1980s that DNA evidence was first used in court. And even then, it was limited, matching direct samples only if the suspect was already in a criminal database. But now? Now DNA doesn't just match criminals to crime scenes. It builds family trees, it tracks bloodlines, it finds hidden connections. And with every new breakthrough, old cases once thought impossible to solve are being cracked wide open. How many more monsters are about to be exposed? Could the next big cold case be solved tomorrow? Or has it already been solved and the killer just doesn't know it yet? Marise's story serves as a chilling reminder. No secret stays buried forever. For decades, James Paul Forte thought he had escaped justice. He died without ever facing the consequences of what he had done. But in the end, science caught up with him, and it will keep catching up. So, to the unsolved cases, to the families still waiting for answers, there is hope. And to the killers who think they've gotten away with it, your past is still out there. And DNA never forgets. Think about it: if Eric Schubert hadn't developed a passion for genealogy, if DNA technology hadn't advanced, if the police hadn't reopened the case after all those years, would we have ever known the truth? James Paul Forte lived and died without facing justice. If even one step in this process had been missed, he might have remained just another forgotten name in Hazleton's history. For nearly 5 decades, the truth was right there, hidden in the evidence, locked in a strand of DNA, waiting for someone to connect the dots. So how many other cases are still waiting? How many families are still living with unanswered questions? And how many killers out there think they've gotten away with it, never realizing that one day their name could surface too? And so, the case of Marise Chiverella, unsolved for nearly half a century, finally had an answer. Her killer had a name. His crime was no longer a mystery. But does knowing who make the pain any less? Does it erase the decades of suffering, the years of not knowing? Or does it simply leave us with new questions? Why did he do it? Was he a serial predator? Could he have been stopped sooner? And more importantly, is this justice? Because while Forte's identity has finally been revealed, the truth remains the same. He died without ever answering for his crime. So what do you think? Would you call this case truly closed? Or is justice something more than just knowing a name? Let's talk about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more true crime cases where justice comes decades later, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because the past is never really buried, and together we'll keep digging for the truth.